All right, so it's the What Happened to Music podcast. We're going to be talking about instrument doubling, more specifically, woodwind doubling.
More specifically, I play the saxophone. Welcome to doubling.
So,
So,
why don't you explain? I mean, for anyone new to
so
this
if
concept
you
of doubling.
if you want to be a professional level saxophone player, that's great. You practice, you do your long tones, you go out, you get gigs and all that good stuff. However, your opportunities will be limited unless you double, which means you play more than one woodwind instrument, not just like more than one saxophone. That's assumed if you're a saxophone player
That is weird how that's like assumed.
that you just happen to have four different saxophones. But on top of that, you have to play other woodwind instruments as well.
I feel like it's not expected that you should have a baritone.
I feel like that's probably the number one. Like you most likely don't have a baritone sax unless you're the baritone sax guy.
Like, I feel it would be expected that you would have, obviously, an alto,
Alto, tenor,
tenor,
probably
and probably a soprano.
probably a cheap soprano.
Yeah. But yeah, I feel baritone would be the one where someone would say, oh, do you have a baritone? But the other ones, I think it's kind of assumed that you have that if you're at a high level.
Yeah. So, but some examples of opportunities that you could have beyond what you would have as just a saxophone player would be pit orchestras for musicals are the biggest one.
Yeah, I feel whenever I play those, I'm always in awe of the
Number of instruments.
number of instruments and the doubling, and then the weird combinations that you'll play with one guy, on one musical, and then you go, oh, he just brought a completely different set of instruments this time.
Well, we'll talk about that, but other opportunities would be cruise ship gigs. That's a good lineup there. Weddings, if you're going to play the ceremony music, definitely.
Yeah.
And then different big bands, depending on the musical selection, they may have doubling, and depending on the director, it may or may not be optional. So the big one being pit orchestra, where you might have read 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, for example. And you said you had a question about that. How does that work?
I feel like they're always sort of in slightly different combinations.
Really, it's not like standard because obviously every musical has a different orchestration, different instrumentation. I've noticed it's usually read 1 will be the higher instruments, like, oh, this is alto sax and flute. Then like read 2 would be like, oh, here's clarinet, and then read 5 would be like bass clarinet, bassoon, bari sax, the lower end.
So what advice would you give in terms of learning the instruments?
Number 1, start with one at a time. It could be very overwhelming. Obviously, like, oh, you're a saxophone player, I expect you to play 5 instruments proficiently at a high level. So just pick one. So like right now, I'm focusing on flute because like that's something I want to build up a little more. So I picked flute because of the opportunities it could give and what it would add to my sound on like a jazz gig. So pick one. Get an instrument that works. It does not have to be a professional quality, several $1,000 instrument, because all the woodwinds get really expensive. The higher up you go, you could get a solid beginner instrument or maybe even an intermediate instrument.
Now, for any guitar person who's listening out there, what's a solid? Let's go with flute. What's a solid beginner intermediate flute cost?
Couple hundred.
Really, you can get away with that cheap on a flute.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you're not necessarily getting the best sound. You're not getting open holes. You're not getting silver. All that good stuff.
My solid gold.
you want an instrument that plays in tune that works. Like the range, the whole range, ideally. So bring a friend with you who actually focuses on that instrument. Have them try it out for you if you're not confident.
That's always just good advice if you don't actually play the instrument.
So like my flute, like I acquired that. It was a secondhand flute, and then I actually took it to a friend who plays flute and asked, "Can you play this for me? Tell me, is it okay, and what quirks would it have?"
Yeah.
So I have that information. So if I have a problem, I know if it's the instrument or I know if it's me. It's usually me. So
just blame it on the reed.
Not on flute.
I know.
One thing I would like to mention is that it does get overwhelming sometimes because you not only need to have the skills on these instruments, but you need to have these instruments physically. Like you need to own them or have access to them readily.
It seems like a good piece of advice is if you're in high school, to try the doubling then.
Start now.
Whatever that happens to be. only because once you get out of high school, it really seems like you're behind the eight ball.
Yeah, and you'll see a lot of good high schools, or at least high schools where the director has some kind of sense about things, will say like, hey, you're a saxophone player, why don't you try noodling on this flute? A really good high school might have performing opportunities for them already.
Yeah. And normally the instruments, tend to be available depending on the district.
Yeah, and don't get discouraged. If you're starting early, you have more than enough time, even if you just play a little bit every day.
What about bad doubling combinations? What should you not double on? I only know of one that's apparently a terrible doubling combination. But
well, woodwind and brass.
although some people can get away with that with marching
I've heard,
band, but it's
yeah.
not needed. I think that would be the issue.
I haven't, like, being a musician and gigging around and knowing what opportunities are, I haven't really seen, oh, this is the woodwind guy and the brass guy.
Yeah.
That's way less common. That's usually a personal life choice if you see somebody doing that.
Bad personal life choice.
For woodwinds, I don't really see a bad one. It's just, what do you want to do with yourself?
Well, the only one that I've heard that's a bad doubling combination, only because of the time and the maintenance, is oboe and bassoon.
Yes.
So that was one that was specifically mentioned where you go, oh, they're both double reed instruments, so you should be able to play oboe and bassoon. But because of the time maintaining and making the reeds, it's basically...
reed making. If you focus on oboe and bassoon, and that's your main instrument, you're spending a lot of time making and adjusting reeds. If you're doubling on it, you could get somebody to do it for you, or...
For any guitar players that are out there, basically oboe and bassoon are double reed instruments, and basically to get and you can correct me, to get one that is makes the characteristic sound and even the actual playing, you basically have to make it yourself, which is a ridiculously time-consuming process. It'd be like, I feel like it would almost have to be the equivalent if you played guitar and you had to change your strings every 4 hours.
And honestly, what I do on saxophone reeds is already more time than I would like to spend, which is very basic stuff. So this whole episode kind of sounds like me whining as a saxophone player. So can you think of other instruments in general about doubling? I would think percussion, if you're a percussionist.
Percussion is, I think, easily the ultimate...
They don't call it doubling. They just call it being a percussionist.
Hey, can you play this? Yeah. I mean, I feel percussionists have the most can-do attitude usually, where it's like, here's a cajon, figure it out, and and obviously it's just rhythmic.
How about as a guitarist? Because I feel like I've encountered quite a few guitarists who refuse to play anything but guitar or electric.
I mean, let me
bass.
put it like this: in terms of pit orchestra stuff. I mean, I feel really comfortable on ukulele. Obviously, guitar, and multiple styles of guitar. Like, there's a big difference between like finger style and then like sort of like rock plectrum style. Banjo, I'm comfortable in like a pit gig where it's like, oh, you have to play this banjo part, or you have to play this line or something like
some
that.
Sweet Dixieland.
That's true. I did do a Dixieland combo, or traditional jazz, depending on what you're calling it. And did I mention mandolin? Mandolin would be another one where it's just like, I mean, those are kind of what's expected of you to be able to play it on a relatively competent level if you're working up the parts, if that makes sense. So I mean, I've seen that all in different books. Also, it's probably would make sense for you to be able to play electric bass to a reasonable level. I mean, that's like a real obvious double. I don't know anyone,
But not upright bass.
but not upright bass. I'm pretty embarrassing when it comes to being on an upright bass. That being said, I can't read for bass.
As a closing thought, it just baffles me. Here's me whining again. It's just like you're a saxophone player. Oh, I assume you play probably flute and clarinet. You're okay in my eyes if you only play one of those, and you're adequate if you play like you could play any woodwind. But say I'm a professional clarinetist, and they're like, that's excellent. What orchestra do you play? Enjoy your clarinetting.
Oh, so you're basically saying as a sax player, you're expecting
like that's the woodwind instrument where they're automatically like, oh, what else do you play besides that? Or it's like, I play bassoon.
Oh,
Thank you for being the only one.
the only one. There can only be one.
Enjoy your only oneing.
No, I mean, that's a good point. There's not a lot of instruments where it's automatically expected that you should be able to double.
Yeah, because if,
I mean,
for example, if you look at audition requirements for a cruise ship gig, which those are really easy, you just Google search and you look at the requirements, like every instrument except for saxophone, they're just like, here's your instrument,
your instrument,
your
as opposed to
requirements.
the
With saxophone,
doubling.
it's like, here's your saxophone requirements, here's your flute requirements, here's your clarinet requirements.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I'm somebody might ask why, but we could save that for a future episode.
Yeah, so if you can think of any instruments maybe that you double on, or
if you have specific questions about it that we could answer for you, leave a comment.